So what exactly are price controls, right? Is this some sort of new concept that Kamala Harris is talking about, or is this something that has been tried pretty much across space and time for at least 4,000 years that we know about? And is there any merit to it, right? It's really easy to take something like this and to categorize it as good or bad, but are there various conditions where price controls might be necessary? And quite frankly, what specifically are prices? Because I think everyone obviously engages with prices, but do we really ask ourselves what they mean and what they represent within the economy? Because this is not just a relevant question of what is going on right now within this presidential election with growing inflation issues, with everything that is frustrating people on a very, very basic level around the dining room table. And everyone is looking for, what are you going to do to fix it? And so when someone says price controls, well, if you're someone that has watched the price of your groceries go up exponentially over the last few years, if you're someone that suddenly feels like the job that you felt comfortable in and was perfectly capable of fulfilling all of your basic economic needs is no longer getting the job done, not because you did anything wrong, not even necessarily because maybe your company's doing anything wrong, but because everything is more expensive. When you hear we need to put price controls on some of these businesses that are gouging people, that just seems to make sense. The question is, does it? And that is the very important question that we are going to answer today on Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Hamilton and I are preparing for a trip over to the UK that we're going to be taking starting on Friday. So,
well, that's all the UK needs right now is more foreigners. Good job. That's
no, what they need right now is some right-wing worldview.
Yeah. No, that's going to be good. You guys are going to have a great trip. Yeah, hey, listen, one of the reasons we want to do this, we actually had some questions within our audience. If you want to go ahead and check that out and check out our community, go over to Circle. You can see the links in the show notes. But this is a question that has been going on. And again, it has become very easy to just say, well, this is communist, right? Don't go full communist, Kamala. This is price controls are bad. But we think it's important. Let's actually understand this topic and let's try to look at it from multiple views and perspectives in order to try to figure out whether or not there is any merit whatsoever. Because again, I'll list two of the most common ones, right? People look at things like minimum wages. People look at things like insulin prices. And these are two of the most common versions of price controls that people might not even think of as price controls, right? So let's go ahead and get that in. What is a price control? Well, essentially, it's the government using legal mechanisms to either set a ceiling or a floor, right? So a ceiling might be the government coming in and going, you can't charge more than this much for X, right? You can't charge this much. You can't charge more than this for insulin. You can't charge more than this for gasoline. You can't charge more than this for steak, whatever it is, right? That's a ceiling. A price floor is you're not allowed to pay less than this, right? So for instance, minimum wage is a price floor. You are not allowed to offer a job which actually pays less than this particular amount. And in both cases, politicians generally sell us on the issue that this is meant in order to either increase wages, right, for people that need it the most, right, or lower the cost of consumer goods for, once again, people that need it the most. And if you're cherry picking your data, you can make some really good arguments, at least some really good emotional arguments for why this might be the only way forward, right? Now, how else are we supposed to fix this problem? Sure, you might be offering this over here or this over here, but that hasn't been happening. We need results now. And this is where the price controls argument actually has the most effect on the general population. But what are prices? Right now, prices are signals. That's what they are at a fundamental level, right? And typically, if you want to lower prices, well, what do? Right? You increase supply. Now, I know of a particular, this works all the day in the free market. And if you want a perfect example of this, if you want a perfect example of a company, right, that is working with prices in order to try to get you what you want at a price you like, right? Good Ranchers, right? Good Ranchers does exactly that, because right now Good Ranchers has a special deal where not only if you use my code, they're going to give you $25 off. So right off the bat, they're making it cheaper for you. Why would they do that if they're a bunch of just greedy profiteers? But that's not all they're going to do, right? If you sign up for one of the subscriptions right now, Good Ranchers is going to give you a free add-on for the next 4 years. It's almost like they're tracking some sort of election cycle there. That's right, because one of the things Good Ranchers understands is the most democratic thing that you actually do on a day-to-day basis is not voting, right? It's not voting every every couple of years, every 4 years for president. That's not what it is. The most democratic thing you do is how you spend your dollars, what you prioritize. And Good Ranchers is trying to entice you to use them, and they're trying to do it a couple ways. One, they're trying to provide you a really, really good product, right? Because we all want meat, right? We all want meat, right? We want the best poultry, pork, wild-caught seafood, beef that we can possibly get, and they're providing that plus free add-ons, right? So they're trying to give you not only a good product, but good value, which means when you get that and you spend the money to Good Ranchers and you get that food showing up with those free add-ons with that $25 off using promo code Nick, all of a sudden you're thinking to myself, this was great. This was a perfect transaction. I spent the money on something that I really wanted and I got a great value for my dollar, so I'm going to continue to go back. So goodranchers.com, use promo code Nick, get that $25 off and get one of those free add-ons for the next 4 years. You really want to exercise what a democratic process. Spend your money on the things that mean the most to you and that give you the most valuable. So you'll be supporting the show, you'll be supporting a great company, and you will be supporting yourself with some of the best, hormone-free beef, poultry, pork, and wild-caught seafood. Goodranchers.com, check that out. Okay, let's jump into this. What are prices? All right, Christian, I know you were excited about this. This is a fun topic. It's one we've talked a lot about because I know growing up, prices were simple, right? What were prices? Prices is whatever the company or the manufacturer or the business person or the lemonade stand owner, prices were just whatever they were charging me to get what I wanted. And there's almost like this adversarial view toward them. Like you're telling me I got to pay this much to get what I want, right? And of course, those companies were motivated exclusively by greed and trying to get as much out of me as they possibly could. And then you kind of think about it, well, wait a second, aren't I trying to get as much as I can from them for the least amount
Don't
possible?
You know that prices are actually just theft?
It's just
right?
theft.
Everything
prices
should
can
just
go
be
both ways too. Price controls can be limits, and they can limits on how high they can go, and they can also be limits on how low they can go.
Well, that's the floor and the ceiling thing.
Yeah.
Right.
About.
For Virginia, if you go buy milk, you can see that it says sold at or above state minimum.
Yeah.
Yeah, so prices are obviously just theft because everything needs to be sold at cost. We just need to everything needs to be collectively owned by the community and this is a genuine argument that socialists make. I mean, because socialism by definition is the idea that the common, collective owns the means of production. And so what you end up inevitably having in a socialist system, a true socialist system, is the abolition of prices, because prices from a socialist perspective is a representation of theft, because they think that profit itself. This is a very common critique that Marxists and socialists make. They believe that profit itself is actually a sign of inefficiency, because profit represents, the amount of wealth that's generated beyond the inputs that are needed to produce a certain product. Mm-hmm. And the idea being that, well, if everything is just collectively owned and if everything is collectively shared, then everything would then be sold at the same cost that it took, in order to produce said thing. This is also why it's seamlessly tied into the labor theory of value.
Yes. Yeah.
But what they miss, and what we're going to get into today, and you have plenty of examples that we actually pulled up before we started recording, some of which I think are more humorous than others, some of which are quite tragic, is that prices are actually a signal. They're not theft. Profit's not theft either. And it's certainly not inefficient. In fact, the inefficiency comes about when you try to impose a collective ownership over the means of production. Prices are a signal. That is the biggest point that we can get across in this part of the episode.
Well, and we need to distinguish here too, right? So like a price is a signal, but the freer the market determines what that signal actually is.
The less noise there is and static there is in receiving that signal.
The way you've got to think about it. Here's what I would encourage people to think about with respect to prices. The freer the market you are operating in, what a price actually does is it plays a coordinating function. Like a coordinating function within the marketplace, because none of us can have absolute knowledge of everything that's going on within the economy at any given time. None of us can have
there's people that believe that, though.
I know, but they're wrong. None of us can have absolute perfect knowledge of what it actually takes to produce something. Probably one of the best works on this that you could ever read was I, Pencil by Leonard Read. And he actually talks about the difficulty of manufacturing a pencil, that we look at something so simple that we can go get for a couple of pennies. And he goes to explain that, well, okay, the wood actually had to be logged from this particular area, then it had to be milled, and then there was those companies that milled the thing. It had to have various tools and equipment necessary. It had to have labor associated with that. The yellow paint that is used on aluminum, that's a completely different resource that was being used, and a different factory that had to produce the paint. And then you have the little graphite that's actually used as the source of the writing. That had to be mined somewhere. That had to be taken. Then you have the little rubber that's used for the eraser. You have the little metal band. All of these different industries are working in conjunction with one another, and not one of those industries by themselves would actually know how to manufacture a pencil, right? And yet somehow all of that comes together in order to create a pen. Now you can think about how much more complex that is when we're talking about building something like an iPhone, or we're building something like a laptop or a television or whatever else it is. And so the question is what does that price represent? Now, a lot of the Marxists, as Christian was pointing out, I would say, well, that just represents the amount of labor that went into it. And that can't totally be true, right? It has to represent more than that. And the way it does that is if a pencil all of a sudden becomes twice as expensive. Now, it could be that the greedy pencil company owner said, wow, we're going to charge twice as much for our pencils because now we're going to make more money. We'll make twice as much profit. But the problem is you can, well, I'm not going to buy your pencils, then I'm going to buy this guy's pencils. Now, how did you know to do that? Did you know to do that because this guy was greedy and mean over here? Or did you know to do that because, well, the price of this pencil is $2, the price of this pencil is $1, whatever it is, right? You just automatically knew, like you made that assessment. You didn't need to know what the motivations were of the company. It could be that the reason why that company is charging more for their pencils is because the area where they were getting graphite, right, just had a major problem, and now they can't get their graphite anymore. And so now they have a scarcity of pencils, and they're trying to charge more in order to make up for it. You don't know anything about whether or not there was a problem with a graphite issue. You don't know if there was a problem with one of their suppliers. You don't know any of that. What you know is this guy charges me this much for this, and this guy charges me that much for that. And what you're automatically doing is you're trying to economize for yourself. You're trying to say, I want to get the best deal possible. I want my money to go as far as possible. And so now I'm going to reorient, my attention from this pencil company to this pencil company. But what happens if you had like a global shortage of graphite? Well, now I'm going to look for an alternative. I don't want the pencil. I want the pen. So you don't need to know about any of those things going on to make those sort of economic decisions. And all of it you make with the help of prices. So that price doesn't just represent how much it costs to make a particular thing. It represents all of the inputs. Right? All of the inputs, that's kind of the labor theory portion, but then it also represents the demand.
And right? it could be higher quality products, lower quality
it
products.
Absolutely could be, but that needs to manifest itself when I actually buy it, right? That price, that higher price in that case needs to represent
We tend to expect you're
value.
going to get something better if you spend more.
I would say it's even deeper than that in some cases. The way that I look at prices it's information.
Yes.
It's information that informs producers how much to produce, but it's also information that informs consumers how much they can consume on a particular product or service. So a good example is if Maseratis were going for $5,000, I would have one.
Yeah.
But there's a reason that I don't have one because they're not going for $5,000. I mean, maybe like a 25-year-old one that has 300,000 miles on it is, right? But the point is that the reason that certain things cost more are the reason why certain people don't afford them. Again, the reason that I don't have a yacht is because it's not in my price point, right? Now, this is interesting because what this is signaling is, again, how much of a certain thing I can purchase, but it's also signaling to the producer how much of a certain thing to produce. And then this is where you get into problems when you actually try to distort prices through a variety of mechanisms. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about price controls, which is probably one of the most nefarious processes through which that information gets distorted. You end up putting static into the airwaves, so to speak, right? Because when you try to take prices out of the equation, that's what you're doing with price controls, right? You're having a third party neutral arbiter, supposedly, that's trying to say, no, we're going to sell the pencil for X, or we're going to put a cap on rents for why. You certainly have a lot of talk about price controls when it comes to housing and rent right now, because that's a big issue. What you end up doing is that you're distorting a market mechanism that is used to inform both producers and consumers how much to produce and how much they can afford to consume on a particular product. And the consequences of that, as we're going to get into today, are actually quite devastating, because it's not the myth is that prices are a form of greed, because profit is a form of greed from a socialist or Marxist perspective. But it's not. It's a form of information that allows for the product to be created in the first place.
That's true. I think the other thing that people need to understand is a lot of times they look at prices from the perspective of the consumer. This is certainly how the Soviets and a lot of the Marxists did. Like, to the extent that they looked at prices, they looked at it just from the idea of the consumer, the person that was going to buy the finished product. They didn't appreciate it with respect to the role prices play with the producers. Prices affect the producers just as much. A lot of times when you buy the end product, that's where you come into contact with the price, right? But in order to create that product, materials had to be bought, workers had to be paid, factories had to be built, capital investments had to be purchased. Like, all of those things are inputs into the final price that you see. And so it's not just that the consumer needs good pricing within a free system in order to make the best decision for themselves on how much money they have and what do they need or want, and how do they best spend it in order to get those things. Producers have to have the same thing. Otherwise, they can't give you accurate prices. And to Christian's point, the difference between profit and prices is that profit is merely something that is a part of the overall price because it's part of the incentive structure, right? It's all fine and good for people to say, well, why can't I just buy it at cost? Like, well, then what's the motivation for me to go through the process of building the factory or hiring people or developing all that? Well, they're like, well, you can get paid. That'll be your contribution. Okay, but the price above what it costs me to produce is actually what I use to repair my equipment and make investments and invest in other things and maybe develop other products. Right. So this idea that,
and it's also not bad to want to make a profit. It's not bad to want to provide a better life for your kids. And that's what everybody's trying to do all along the way. But when you end up with, price controls ultimately end up leading to scarcity. You have problems with that. And then on the other end, then the government steps in and says, oh, we've got this problem. Let's just do a subsidy. So they're going to get the money from you either by you volunteering to pay them for the price they need, or the government's just going to steal it from you and give it to companies.
It's the old Harry Brown
the
quote.
biggest companies that didn't die from the policy.
You guys have heard of the Harry Brown quote, right? The government breaks your legs and hands you crutches and then says, see, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't be able to walk.
Yeah. Well, and I think, but the critical part, because I don't want to get too far afield here. Like, we have to establish what this is first. Prices are not just some. Let me reword this. Prices are not supposed to be some arbitrary thing developed by a CEO, a politician, or a consumer.
And they're not a representation of greed either.
Wait a second. What prices are ultimately is a form, like Christian said, is a form of information. What it does is it helps simplify all the complex factors that went into the production, distribution, advertising, creation, and selling of a particular product, right? That helps you make good decisions on what you want to buy and how much of it, right? That's what it does. So if you are, so think about it. In a perfect world, what that is you have suppliers and you have consumers working together, trying to figure out what they want, right? Like that in that free system where you have property rights, that evil, greedy producer, he can't force you to buy his product, right? You got to voluntarily want to, which means regardless of his motivation, he has to use resources effectively and efficiently in order to get you what you want for the price you're willing to pay that also meets his or her need, which is making the profit, right? And so when you have that system where consumers are allowed to spend how they want, where producers have the maximum amount of freedom in order to
take the risk,
purchase resources in order to get you what you want, you have the best environment possible for prices to actually reflect supply and demand.
And they immediately respond. There's no big lag.
Very quick response when you have that sort of environment where both consumers and producers are able to operate relatively freely in order to figure out those problems. Because that's what it is. The problems that we go into the marketplace to solve our problems. Right? How am I want transportation, I want communication, I want entertainment. I go into the marketplace to solve those problems, and that's what we're all trying to do. We're all trying to figure out how do we give, how do we transact, how do we do that in order to achieve that. Prices, that's why I said at the very beginning, they play a coordinating function within the economy because they give us a wealth of information right then, right there on what we need to make the best decision possible without having to know complex. I don't need to know what the weather is like, right, in Brazil that's going to affect a certain market for whatever. The entrepreneur does that for me, and then it's reflected in the prices. That's why this is so important. And the reason why you have to understand this is because once we get into but why can't the government do X, Y, or Z?
Yeah, so what happens when you try to abolish prices, Nick?
You are whether you're trying to abolish them or whether you're just trying to manipulate them, what you're now doing, you've got to think of it this way. The government is now asking to add incorrect information into the equation in order to achieve a result. They're now trying to manipulate this process that is going on, right? It is manipulation. You can't get around that. It's manipulation. So let's talk a little bit about what we call the economic calculation problem, the socialist calculation problem. This was Ludwig von Mises. He's part of the Austrian school of economics. And one of the things he was seeking to do was to explain why socialism can't work. Like you've heard a lot of people, socialism is a great idea in theory, it just doesn't work in practice.
Oh, there's many conservatives that will say that as well.
Mises is like, no, it's bad theory. It doesn't work in theory or in practice. And the argument that he was making is that if you take socialists at their word, and a lot of people try to conflate socialism, or a lot of people try to act like socialism and communism are two vastly different things. They're not. The key function, whether you're a utopian socialist, whether you're a Fabian socialist, whether you're a Jacobin, whether you're a scientific socialist, as Marx liked to coin the phrase in order to combat the utopians, regardless, there's a common theme amongst all of that, and that is the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. What does that mean? You're allowed to own your shirt. You don't get to own the company that makes the shirt. That has to be owned collectively, which in every practice, in every major practice, the government has owned it, right? Because the government is the voice of the people, right?
And now, can't there be variations of that? Because sometimes they'll say, oh, well, the government doesn't actually own that, but then there's so many restrictions and the government gets so much benefit that
that's why Nick said
effectively almost own it.
That's why Nick said that the overarching theme here is the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production.
It's like that's the goal.
The way that this manifests,
the thread. That's the thread among all socialists.
The way that this
and then there's
manifested,
like a range, sort of a
the way that this has
spectrum.
manifested itself in like the Soviet Union or Cuba is direct government ownership over the factory, right? The shirt factory, the pencil factory. But I mean, when you apply this on a smaller scale, though, this is also why you get things like communes in the United States, right? You know, the hippie communes. There's actually one in Virginia, not too far in Louisa County, that's been around for quite a while. And now they still have a government-like structure, right? But they're not a state, right?
Yeah.
They're not the Soviet Union. But the point is that there's still not private ownership of the means of production. Now, what's interesting is that Mises would tell you it doesn't matter if it's the Soviet Union or your local hippie commune. Both of them will still end in failure, though, because you don't have private ownership of the means of production. And the economic calculation problem kind of articulates this quite well. There's also some moral and ethical problems that maybe we can get to at the end of this episode. Like, well, if two people want to use the shirt factory to produce different types of shirts,
how do you adjudicate that?
How do you adjudicate that? You can only do it through force if it's collectively owned by the community, right? Because a minority of people will lose out on that collective decision on how to best use the shirt factory.
Well, and that's why this is another why, and this is very important. Please listen to me when I say this. There's another reason why there's such an emphasis on democracy. Because one of the ways that Marx and everyone all thought that you would adjudicate this, how would you decide who got to use what on the collectively owned means of production? Oh, well, of course you would use democratic principles in order to decide that. Well, okay, but from a practical implementation method, does that mean every time a company has to produce anything, you have to get what? You have to get a vote from the entire population of what? The world, the country, the commune, the factory? Like, what do you need to do? At what point does it cease to become democratic if you're not including everyone? If all the comrades don't get to vote on what the shirt factory is going to produce, is it a democratic ownership? Do all the people really own it? Do just the people that work in the company own it?
And again, what about those who lose out on the vote? In the free market, those who lose out on the vote, let's say and I'm going somewhere with this because this is going to be tied into the economic calculation problem. In a centrally planned economy, I'll take the Soviet Union, for example. You have a shirt factory, or let me rephrase this. You have a textile mill. This textile mill can produce winter clothing, it can produce jackets, or it can produce, let's say, jeans, right? If you have the collective, if you have the people that get to decide how is the factory going to operate, what is it going to produce? Let's say a majority of people vote for jeans and a minority of people vote for jackets for the winter. Well, the minority have now lost out because, well, the majority rules, and since it's collectively owned, we're not going to be producing jeans. Well, what if they want jackets? What if the people that voted for the jackets are living in Siberia and they need jackets? Mm-hmm. Well, now you have a shortage of jackets because the collective voted to produce jeans instead. This is actually part of the reason why you get shortages. In a free market, though, guess what? One factory might be producing jeans, but guess what? If there's enough demand for jackets, the market will end up providing factories that will be producing jackets. You don't need to have a vote on it. The vote is taken by you as an individual voting with your money. That's why you said the most democratic thing is actually a free market where you get to vote not for who's going to rule over your life. You don't vote for the politician.
Dollar.
You vote with your dollars. And the market will then provide based on the amount of demand that's there. So that way the people in Siberia actually have access to jackets.
Instead of voting for the jackets and then the manufacturers just receive a list of quotas, and in order to make the quotas, we were just talking about how they would make things smaller, or they would make things not to reflect what the people actually needed. It was just to meet the quota, so it would be easier to meet the quota.
So here's the central argument of the economic calculation problem. Somebody's heard of this in the podcast, and they're probably thinking, great, what does this have to do with jackets or jeans? I'm going to read it off on our notes just to get this across to people. Without market prices, it's impossible to make rational economic decisions about what to produce, how much to produce, and which production methods to use, because there are no price signals to reveal the relative scarcities and values of different resources. And then the implication is, in a centrally planned economy where the state controls the means of production and prices are set by planners rather than the market, economic inefficiency and waste are inevitable because it's impossible to calculate the most efficient use of resources. That is the economic calculation problem.
And this is and a lot of people on the left have tried to combat this, but like, what are you talking about? Soviets were able to produce this and produce that. It's like, this is not a question of what you can produce. So Thomas Sowell I once saw him explain in Basic Economics, he goes, economics is the study of the use of scarce resources that have alternative uses. So understand something. If I give you an apple, you can eat that apple. That's one use of the apple. You can make an apple pie. That's another use of the apple. You can make apple juice. That's another use of the apple. How do we decide what you want? Like, how do we determine that? Well, through free exchange and prices is how we determine it. How much did it cost me to grow the apple? How many apples do you need for the intended purpose? How much value do you place on that purpose versus how much value somebody else would place on the purpose?
What are you willing to pay?
What are you willing to pay? And here's the issues. The problem is that the central planners will argue, like, what are you talking about? We can absolutely allocate resources. We did it in the Soviet Union all the time. We determined what was going to be built. The question is why are they being made in the first place? Right? The basic assumption, this is one of those key moments you need to really grasp, is because the argument that the socialists often make, the argument that the price control advocates often make, is that they are doing this for the people. The reason why you need state ownership of the means of production, the reason why you need more centralized control of the economy, is because you're going to be the ones to take care of people in a way that those greedy capitalists won't, because they don't care. But the problem is that if you are prioritizing production based off of what central planners think you want, as opposed to what people actually want, what you're saying ultimately through your actions is the economy is supposed to work for whatever the central planners think it should work for, as opposed to what people engaging in voluntary transactions should think it should work for. So it does us nothing to say, oh, comrade, look at the number of concrete. Look at the amount of concrete we've made, comrade, if what people really want are coats. Well, yes, but comrade, look at the number of tires we've made. Yeah, but it takes me 10 years to get a car.
It's actually more nefarious than that. In the Soviet Union, what you ended up having, because everything was centrally planned, was it wasn't that they were making too much concrete when they needed coats. It's that they were making worse kinds of coats than what individuals needed, because what they were doing was basically quota production. So like the analogy that I keep thinking of is consumer demands were usually met by targets and quotas, and this was defined by things like tons or yards. So you would have tons of cloth, or how many yards of cloth can be produced. But what this inevitably ended up resulting in is that you would constantly have a shortage of specialty items within broad categorizations. So yes, the Soviet Union could say, oh, look at, we made X tons of cloth this year, and, this is more than enough for everybody in the country. Yeah, but did you make enough coats for the woman that is, 5'2" and 100 pounds?
Yeah.
Like, no, instead you made a bunch of large, triple X large coats because you met the quota of the amount of pounds that you needed to produce on a certain textile mill. But that doesn't help the 19-year-old woman that's 100 pounds soaking wet.
Yeah.
Great. She has an
Siberia.
excellent selection of triple X sized coats to choose from at the department store. This is also why so in the Soviet Union you constantly had shortages of of clothing for women and clothing for children. Mm-hmm. Because they weren't producing things for the consumer. They were producing things for the government regulator that was setting the quotas. And the quotas were not set based on how much people needed. The quotas were based on how much output could we get in terms of, again, things like tonnage or yards or square footage. And so it wasn't that they were making too much concrete and not enough coats. It's that they were making too many of the wrong kind of coat because there were no prices. This is why... This is where you get the interplay of prices into the economic calculation problem. When you abolish private property, what you have done is you've abolished prices. But prices are not a form of greed. Prices are not a form of theft. Prices are information. They are signals. They tell consumers how much to produce of a certain thing. And when you make everything centrally owned, when you make everything collectively possessed by the people, what you've done is you've abolished prices. And when you've abolished prices, what you end up having is the Austrians actually came up with a phrase with this. They said that it was groping in the dark.
Yeah.
And I mean,
well, we're going to get into some examples of this, but to move on to the next issue that we're going to talk about here, the central thing that people need to understand about the economic calculation problem, it is this idea of you can put as many experts as you want with as much data as you want in a room, and sure, they will be able to tell you something about production. They will be able to direct production if they get the means of legal force to do it. Like if you lose your job at the factory, unless you produce what the regulators told you to produce, yes, you will probably get a certain amount of X that meets whatever the basic government requirement was. Like you will get that. The problem that Mises is pointing out is that but the way an economy is supposed to function, the reason why we engage in it's not a machine, it's us. The economy is us engaging in voluntary and hopefully mutually beneficial transactions. But if you say, no, the means of production cannot be owned by individuals, it can only be owned by the state or the collective. Mm-hmm. Well, then ultimately what you mean is that those companies, that means of production is going to produce things based off of what government regulators think. And Mises is actually being generous here. Mises is saying, I want you to imagine that every central planner is smart and ethical. He goes, they're all smart, they're all ethical, which means they're not trying to make dumb decisions. They're not deliberately making foolish decisions, or they're not just a bunch of morons, saying, oh, comrade, more concrete, less jacket, right? That's not what they're doing. And they're not corrupt.
That's very generous.
So, but think about that. That's the reason why this was such a damning analysis of it is because Mises is like, I'm going to concede that you're all great and you all want the best possible outcome for all the people. Mm-hmm. You can't do it.
It still doesn't work.
You
still end up with North Korea.
And then what we ended up finding out is that, okay, But now let's interject the fact that people can be stupid, that they can be motivated by things other than altruism, that it turns out the great central planners within government are not just a bunch of wonderful people that have the best ideas and want to help everybody. Turns out they might have some of their own interest. It turns out that corruption seeps into the equation. So imagine the overall argument being, under ideal conditions, here's why this fails. This is the whole concept of it's bad in theory too.
Right. Well, also the even just implementing all of this creates so much limitation, and people don't like limitation, and everyone's looking for a way to get more for themselves naturally. And so of course you're going to see somebody that's so completely limited on what's allowed and what they can get and for what price and all of that. Well, if they make it high enough into the hierarchy of the equation, then they can start scooping in more for themselves. It's like you've set up a system for that to be a motivation in order to keep it tamped down for everybody else and pull in more.
You've created
for
a
yourself.
perverse incentive structure, for sure.
And this is also where, Ayn Rand used to refer to this as the power of pull. So instead of the power of money or stuff like that, it was, no, you have the power of pull. How close am I to the political decision makers that have the machine guns, right? That can dictate policy. If I'm close enough to them, I will get special privileges. And if I'm not, I'll be left in the cold. And so now all of a sudden, instead of a system which incentivizes you to produce better products at more effective and efficient mechanisms in order to give people what they want, now it's all about how close can I get to the decision makers? How close can I get to the central planners? Right? That's the incentivization that's created within this system. But to your point, and this goes into the next thing that we're going to talk about, right? Before we get into some of our most practical examples of this. The next theory, so that's you have what are prices? Prices play a coordinating function. That's information about what it costs to actually produce things and what do people actually want. The socialist calculation problem, or the economic calculation problem, was this idea that if you centralize it, if you take out ownership of the means of production, and you no longer have prices for the means of production, then you can't have accurate prices for consumer goods. And now everything is about producing things in accordance with what the regulators want as opposed to what consumers want. And the regulators don't have prices to work with either, right? Because if it's all owned collectively, what is the price of concrete if I need it to build a bridge versus I need it to build a building? What is the price associated with that when it's all just collectively owned? Well, it's whatever the central planner tells me it is. Right, so there's the problem, right? You've taken prices out of the production side. You're pretending that you can have them at the consumer side, and we'll get into some of the ways that the central planners did this in the Soviet Union and other places. You're pretending but they're arbitrary, because prices need to reflect information along the entire production cycle, from the moment you cut down the tree to the moment you build the bench, and everything in between. All of that has to have prices associated with it if you actually want a consumer price that means anything, right? So that's the problem that Mises, and then it goes into, well, then maybe this is just a knowledge problem. Maybe if the central planners had the right algorithms, you're right. You know what, Nick? Okay, good point. Point taken. In the Soviet Union in 1954, when they're trying to decide how many benches to build or how much concrete to produce or how many jackets and what type of jackets, they didn't have the amazing artificial intelligence and computer algorithms and computing power that we do today. And so now if we can just get the right central planners with good altruistic motives, right? People that really want to help the people, right? That are not greedy, that are not tempted by corruption. We can just get that person, and then we can get into the hands of that person these incredible computers and algorithms. Well, then we've solved the problem, right? We've solved the problem. And this is where we get into the knowledge problem that Friedrich Hayek talks about. So go in and give us the central argument of that and kind of the implications.
Yeah, so the knowledge problem in some ways builds off of the economic calculation problem. You brought up Hayek, who's another Austrian economist, articulated this problem. And the central argument of the knowledge problem is this: the necessary information for making economic decisions is widely scattered among individuals and is often context-specific and time-sensitive. The example that I gave earlier is a 100-pound woman soaking wet that's 5'2" has different clothing needs than a 300-pound linebacker, right? They're not going to be wearing the same size coat. But central planners or regulators lack access to this dispersed information, making it difficult to coordinate economic activities effectively through top-down control. And the implication of the knowledge problem is that central planning is inherently flawed because it cannot utilize localized knowledge that individuals possess about particular circumstances of time and place, leading to less efficient and often inappropriate decisions. It's even worse than the fact that there's biological differences between a 100-pound woman soaking wet and a 300-pound linebacker, because the 100-pound woman who's soaking wet, there actually is no such thing because there's individuals. There's different there's thousands of different 100-pound women out there, and there's thousands of different linebackers out there. Well, actually, there might be only a couple hundred linebackers out there.
Yeah.
But the point is that there's individuals. There's not these broad categorizations of people. Oh, you're a linebacker, or oh, you're a 100-pound woman. No, you're John Q. Public, or you're Sue Doe, you're John Doe.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we're individuals with our own individual needs and wants and desires and interests. So this might seem superficial, but it speaks to a larger point. What if my favorite color is red and I want a red coat? That's different than somebody who might be the same dimensions as me, the same age as me, the same height as me, the same weight as me, but they want a blue coat. Now, obviously, the difference between a red coat and a blue coat might be, minimal when it comes to, the effectiveness of actually doing the job in the rain. But at the end of the day, I want a particular type of item because I am who I am. I can't be anybody other than Christian Hines. My favorite color is red. It's not yellow.
Yeah, so it doesn't account for style.
You
may prefer, one person may prefer like a double-breasted,
and that's a minimal thing,
right?
Because that's not utility, that's style. But this speaks to a deeper problem, though, because it actually bleeds into the utilitarian issues. Because at the end of the day, it's not just that centrally planned economies like the Soviet Union were producing way too many oversized boots or oversized clothes. Another example is they were producing way too many oversized nails. Because again, there was the
way the quota was written.
The quota was written is how many pounds of iron can you produce? And so it was like every nail factory in the Soviet Union was producing these massive nails. And so like if you wanted to hang a picture in your living room, you were using these like massive industrial sized nails, like nail them into the wall to hang like a photo or something like that. It wasn't just that they were overproducing based on quantity. There was no quality in the Soviet Union because everything was built around quotas. And it wasn't just that they were making poor, decisions when it comes to quantity decisions. There was no quality in the Soviet Union whatsoever. There was no style. There was no uniqueness because even within categorizations, there's categorizations within categorizations. Yeah. And so like that, the knowledge problem is ultimately boiled down to the fact that we are not a hive mind. The economic calculation problem is where on earth do I actually put these resources? Because again, I'm groping in the dark. I don't have any knowledge. I don't have any information of anything because prices are a form of information. And if everything's collectively owned, then all that you're doing is you're just exchanging things within a collectively owned unit. And so there can't be prices on anything because prices can only exist within an entity where there's private ownership over the means of production. The knowledge problem gets into us as individuals. We are not part of some blob. Now, I disagree with some neoliberals that say that there are no such things as society. This is actually a quote from Margaret Thatcher, so this is a critique that I have of certain forms of libertarian type thinking. But at the end of the day, the point that these people are bringing up, correctly so, is that we are individuals. I am not just a 5 foot. I'm gonna, this is a ding on myself. I'm only 5'5", and I'm only like 130 pounds or 125 pounds. I've lost a lot of weight this year. But I'm not just an individual who's a white male who's 30 years old that's 5'5" and weighs 125 pounds. I'm Christian Hines. I have my own interests. I have my own desires. I have my own things that I want to buy in the marketplace. And the knowledge problem basically is arguing that central planners are incapable of knowing what that is because the only person that can know what that is you. You are the only one that can know what you want.
And that's why the market still works. And that's what's so interesting is in these type of environments, you end up with black markets, and you end up with people will still get what they want. They just get it at a much higher price. One of our people in the chat mentioned that they remember when American-made Levi's were illegal in the USSR, and that you could sell a pair in Moscow for $200 because they had, laws against it. Now, this was Chalet Demers. That was a great comment. But it reminded me that, look, the black market will come into this at some point, and people will end up spending a lot to get it because people want unique things, because we are all unique people. They want what they can't have a lot of times. It's as simple as you've got, straight hair, you want curly hair, whatever. You want a lot of times what you don't have access to. And so then you'll obsess over, how do I get access to this thing? And so maybe you're saving and saving and saving so that you can then go and get it. And now, like, this pair of Levi's that would be cheap here in the US in the 80s would be $200 on a pair of jeans in the 80s. Like, in the 80s, you were buying jeans for $10.
Well, and I think it's, again, this goes to the other major problem here. And again, the fundamental question that's actually being asked through the answer, right? So Mises says it's you can't calculate things because you don't have the proper info, or you don't have accurate information in order to do it. They say, okay, fine, we just need better information. And then Hayek comes in and goes, no, you don't get it. You can't get the information through the mechanism you're trying to get it. The information can only come when you have individual actors able to interact with other individual actors in the marketplace in order to determine supply and demand. If you erase that mechanism, you can't get the price information you need. You can't get it. Like, that's the part that well, but what if we had an algorithm? No, because the price, the information that you need has to come from, literally, if we're talking about the global economy, billions of people operating within their own interests, within their own economizing principles, right, on a daily basis. This is also where you get the Austrian theory of marginal utility, that not everything, this cup of coffee I have right here does not have equal value to all people. Guess what? It won't even have equal valuable to me in an hour. In an hour, I will not value this cup of coffee the way I would have right now. And so there's different value propositions, and they're changing constantly. There's no central planner. There's no computer program. There's no nothing. And even for the people that say, well, yeah, but AI, Nick, it does. Okay, but AI, right, is a generated algorithm, which means what AI tells you is not necessarily what all people want, or even the most amount of people want. AI algorithms can be just as much generated to tell you whatever the person generating the code wants. And so, once again, the only system that gives you the proper information to make prices as effective as possible is the one where free individuals are able to negotiate prices, to negotiate inputs and outputs based off of supply and demand and individual needs, wants, and desires. If you believe that the economy is supposed to serve people as opposed to central planners, as opposed to governments, as opposed to political ideologues, then that's the sort of system you have to have. And again, I find it amazing. I'm looking at some of the comments, like, we need global unions now. Like, no, you need individuals free to be able to act. That's what you need, both from the producer side and the consumer side, because all of us are consumers, and all of us should be, on some level, producers. So if you punish one to try to help the other, you are ultimately just punishing yourself. You're ultimately just punishing yourself. Now, here's what we need to get into. Despite the fact that now we've discussed what prices are, it's a source of information about supply and demand and individual needs, wants, and desires with respect to scarce resources that have alternative uses, right? That's what prices do. They play that coordinating function, right? What's the calculation problem? Okay, how do we figure out what prices should actually be? And again, Mises' argument is that you can't do it through direct central planning. You don't have necessary information.
You just leave it alone.
The Marxist response is, we'll get better information.
No.
Hayek's response to that is, you can't. You can't. Like, it's not possible. Please understand this. It is not possible. Not if you want an economy that is rooted around the idea of serving individual needs, wants, and desires. If you just want it to be central planners, okay, you can do that. Yes, comrade, your concrete numbers are excellent, right? But if you actually want an economy that serves people instead of central planners, instead of a political ideology, you have to have that. So That's the response to it. And yet, Kamala Harris comes out there. Well, what we need are price controls. Okay, all right. Let's maybe we're being mean here. Maybe we're cherry picking our stats and we're just picking the Soviet Union. And they're like, and Nick, as we all know, that wasn't real socialism, right?
Oh, because it's never been tried.
That wasn't real socialism. It's never been tried. So I want to go to this first article here that we're going to bring up. And we got a lot here from Foundation for Economic Education. A lot of different authors in here. But this,
Hang on.
this first one.
Before we do,
Yeah.
I want you to get a good laugh. This is the best example I could think of the inefficiency that you get with central planning tied to the economic calculation problem and the knowledge problem. I'm going to read it off for our audio listeners. This is a meme with the politball with the Soviet Union, and it says, when your nuclear power plant in Chernobyl fulfills the 5-year plan of heat energy generation in 4 microseconds.
Yeah. Hey, technically you made your numbers.
Technically you made your numbers, but you misappropriated where that energy was going to be going and to what purpose. The point is that, sorry, I had to bring that up.
That
I
is
just
funny.
had to bring that up.
No.
The point is that actually gets to, in a memey kind of funny way, the inefficiency involved there, right? Because it doesn't matter about, oh, great, we generated the amount of energy output that we needed to power a city. Yeah, great. You did it in the wrong place, aka outside the reactor, and at the wrong time. All at once, rather than over a 5-year period or whatever.
Well, technically, comrade, heat generation blew all expectations.
So explain this video here from.
No, we're not going to do that. I want to go to this next
Okay.
this article over here. So this goes into I love this article. The title of it, the title of it is essentially 4,000 years of failure, and it takes a look at price controls. And what's interesting is that it goes back to some of like really, really early archaeological sites within Mesopotamia where the government had actually set prices for things like you cannot charge more than this for so much wheat, or you can't charge this many shekels for this. And we've talked before on the show about how Diocletian in the Roman Empire tried to do the same thing, where he actually tried to impose it across the board. Egypt actually went so far as to not only have price controls, but to also have labor controls where you were required to go into the same occupation as your father, right? So it was the idea is like, okay, you guys are blacksmiths. Guess what? That's all you are. You're blacksmiths. You don't get to do anything else because we need blacksmiths. We need our quota of blacksmiths. And so that's how you're going to do it. The central planners actually determine what labor looked like. You can imagine what a completely mechanically disinclined, unmotivated blacksmith probably produced, right? Probably not the best swords, right? All right. But then there's other examples too, because I don't want to just point to antiquity. I don't want to just point to the Soviet Union. Let's also look at the UK, which is actually kind of known for, well, I mean, my gosh, when you look at the Wealth of Nations, that came out of the Scottish Enlightenment and Adam Smith. And a lot of the people we talk about are Austrian school, but there was a lot of great thinkers within the UK. UK was one that embraced industrialization, but also as far as free markets go, right, it was still very mercantilist with certain things. But by comparison, the UK was incredibly free market based off of its continental, and certainly places in other parts of the world. But there's an argument here that is done in this article that we picked specifically, and it goes, and there's this British colony of Bengal, right? So this is talking about price controls. Located in northeast India, few people today remember the Bengal famine of 1770, which is astonishing considering that an estimated 10 million people died, roughly a third of its population. What's even more astonishing is how little attention the event attracted at the time, at least in the London press. While many attributed the famine to monsoons and drought that plagued the region in 1768 and 1769, Adam Smith, writing in The Wealth of Nations, correctly observed that it was the price controls that came afterwards that likely turned a scarcity of food into a full-blown famine. So this is an important distinction here. He's saying that, yes, there was a certain reality. There was a certain natural reality that you couldn't necessarily stop, right? Monsoons, earthquakes, tornadoes, right? There's certain things that it's just reality. It's not capitalism. It's not socialism. It's just reality, right? But the response to the reality exacerbated the problem because the drought in Bengal a few years ago might probably have occasioned a very great dearth. Some improper regulations, some injudicious restraints imposed by the servants of the East India Company upon the rice trade contributed perhaps to turn that death into a famine. when the government, in order to remedy the inconveniences of a dearth, orders all the dealers to sell their corn at what it supposes is a reasonable price, it either hinders them from bringing it to market, which may sometimes produce a famine even in the beginning of the season, or if they bring it thither, it enables the people and thereby encourages them to consume it so fast as much necessarily produce a famine before the end of the season. So what he's saying is that when you artificially manipulate the prices, even if you think you're doing something nice, like I'm helping out poor people because we don't have enough food, so I'm going to keep the price low. Well, that doesn't change any of the actual material conditions on the ground. If the material conditions on the ground is supply is down and demand is high, prices have to go up. They have to go up for two reasons. One, because it's an accurate reflection of what's actually taking place on the ground. But two, as that price goes up, what you actually encourage entrepreneurs to do is say, I can make money in rice. Right? I can make money in the thing that there is a shortage of, so I'm going to allocate resources toward a particular thing. Now, when it's agriculture, it can be a little bit more difficult because there's seasonal conditions and things of that nature, but there's other things that you can also do to alternatives to rice. Now you start to look at what are things that I might be able to do that might be able to provide for a need that is desperately met right now, and the prices are high, so I have an incentive to actually spend time, resources, money, capital investment to get into this. Right? Is it temporary? Is it long term? The entrepreneur is thinking about all of these things, and the high prices incentivize them to start focusing on this problem. Right? Maybe I was focused on this problem over here, but all I know is prices went up. That's a better problem for me to focus my time and energy on. And so now what am I doing? Now, let's say you're the greediest, meanest entrepreneur on the planet. You couldn't care less if people are dying. All you know is that if you start actually producing food sources to meet the demand with this famine, you're going to make a lot of money. Do you not want them to be incentivized to do that? Do you want a system that says, no, you're not allowed to do that? I would rather people starve. Because you should just be good. You should just do it anyways. Okay, well, are the regulators doing that?
No.
Are the regulators getting out and actually producing more food products? Or are they just regulating prices?
What these people want is the new Soviet man, is what they want. They want to remold human nature in their own image because they think that mankind is perfectible, and they think utopia is perfectible. And so it ultimately, they're not satisfied with saying, I'm going to take selfishness and create a market structure in which selfishness can actually be, believe it or not, used in a way that is beneficial to the entire marketplace, to individuals. They want to eradicate selfishness itself because they think that selfishness is always a bad thing.
Well, they confuse what you might call selfishness versus self-interest. Yeah. All of us are by necessity self-interested. If you weren't self-interested, you'd die of starvation, right? You would die because you wouldn't be actually willing to put in the effort to make yourself, to groom yourself, to feed yourself, to get necessary sleep, to take care of yourself physically, emotionally. You wouldn't do any of it because why do you care? That's self-interest. And self-interest is perfectly appropriate and actually necessary to survival. Selfishness is when I'm going to engage in something, maybe possibly to your detriment, and I don't care about any of the moral consequences associated with it because all I care about is how things affect me. And the problem is when you conflate those two things, right, you create a real problem. You create a real moral problem because you're not making the proper distinction. The other problem that's being made here is that if you honestly think you're going to get rid of selfishness, which would be a good thing, right? I would love to get rid of selfishness. But does your system actually do that? Because if you replace individual actors operating based off of self-interest, which you falsely, confuse as selfishness, or in an attempt to stick it to the selfish people, you get rid of, you hurt everybody that's just operating off of self-interest. Does that actually produce better results? Do all the altruists just go into government and then perfectly allocate resources? Do all the people who mean well actually know what it means to plant rice and effectively distribute it? Like, this is one of the biggest problems too, is you have all these people like, I'm such a good person, I would never do it that way. Oh, that's excellent. Do you actually have the capability to do it? Well, no, but I have the capability to opine on how everyone else should do it. Oh, well, thank you for that. Thank you for your feedback. I'm still starving, but I really appreciate that you don't think I should be. Right? Like, that's essentially the sort of world that they're creating. It may make them feel very good, and that's one of the things that I've noticed about socialists, is they're very, very good at making themselves feel better about their own angst.
It's all cope.
They're not very good at actually solving the real problems that created the angst in the first place. And so I've come to the conclusion that maybe what socialists are trying to solve is their angst, not problems. Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and I want to go to another example here. And this kind of does dive into the Soviet Union because this is the largest, most elaborate example of central planning that the world has ever seen. You could argue that, again, some things that happened under the French Revolution, where, again, they were printing a lot of paper money and then all of a sudden prices were going up as a result of monetary policy. And so their solution was, well, we'll just cap prices. Well, if I can't get the money I need to produce the thing you want, I stop producing the thing you want, or I sell it on the black market for what it actually costs to make and what I can be incentivized to do it.
It sounds like the Jacobins were the first MMT proponents.
Yeah. All right. So how did the Soviet Union try to play this out? So for all the people who think price controls are a great idea, if you just have the right people, the right knowledge doing it, he goes, well, the Soviet government, in accordance with the principles of state socialism, owned and controlled all industry in the country. The economy was managed by Gosplan, a central planning agency that set levels of production, wages, and prices. For Soviet ideologues, Gosplan would replace the free market, maximizing efficiency in production and allowing for more equitable distribution of goods and services. To accomplish this task, Gosplan utilized a system of material balances. All right, so did they eliminate waste? The article goes on to explain. Hardly. Gosplan began using material balance planning to manage the economy shortly after Joseph Stalin came to power. Utilizing a vast bureaucracy, Gosplan would estimate public demand for goods and take in the considerations of high-ranking government officials to determine the total output of a commodity for an entire year. Central planners would then draw up balance sheets for each commodity outlining the total output of the commodity and the total input required to produce the desired output. Material balance planning worked, in quotes, by getting all balance sheets to balance simultaneously. A Herculean task considering Gosplan made balance sheets for nearly 20,000 different commodities. The thinking went that by accounting for all resources with a central agency, Gosplan could eliminate waste and ensure that every resource could be fully utilized. One of the arguments that you see in the West for this, and Bernie Sanders has brought this up, he's like, why do we need 40 different types of deodorant? Right? And if the government created a deodorant, they could create like 3 or 4 really good deodorants that meet various needs and health needs. But then you wouldn't have to advertise. You wouldn't have to waste all this money in advertising. You wouldn't have to waste all this money on these other branding exercises and things like that to try to manipulate people. And then we could save all that money through advertising. And then you would just get one product at a very low price that would serve everybody. Of course, it negates the fact that, okay, well then why didn't that work for the Soviets? Right? Why did you get either a shortage of deodorant or deodorant nobody liked or deodorant that didn't really work? Well, because they were meeting what Bernie Sanders thought deodorant should look like instead of 330 million Americans showing up to the store to buy deodorant. That's always the arrogance of the central planner. I can see the problem with this. Oh, really? Have you worked in that industry? No. Okay, do you know anything about the customer base other than your own experience? Well, no. Do you know anything about the supply and demand issues with respect to providing the good or service? Well, no. But I know what I think the world should look like. And so therefore, I will dictate what the world should look like for 330 million consumers because I'm a good person.
And if somebody doesn't like that, then they're wrong.
They're greedy.
They just have wrong thinking and need to be re-educated.
I was about to say, like, the hubris of these people to say, I know what you want better than you yourself.
Yeah.
Who the hell are these people? Like, who do they think they are? Seriously, if you think about it, the amount of insanity and cruelty that goes into that thought process. We talked about the knowledge problem earlier. The knowledge problem is basically predicated on you, Nick Freitas, know what you want better than anybody else. And you know what? Sometimes you might make a mistake because humans are fallible. But at the end of the day, what you will inevitably get better results if you allow the decision making. The question is not who's going to be doing planning. Or whether or not planning is going to take place. The question is who's going to be doing the planning.
Yeah.
Like what socialists and communists don't understand is that libertarians, I can't believe I'm defending libertarians for once after spending the last year like trashing them, but libertarians and Austrian economists, obviously, it's not that they disagree that planning should take place. It's that they disagree that you, the Gosplan, you, Bernie Sanders, you, the commissar, or, whoever the central planner is, should be the one dictating the planning for an entire nation of people, all of society. What the Austrians all that they're advocating for is that the planning should begin with the individual in mind. Because when you strip the individual of their own agency to plan for themselves, what you inevitably get is not the best case scenario. is that you get shortages.
Yeah.
The best case scenario is that you get inefficiencies. The worst case scenario is that you actually snuff out creativity and quality and beauty. It gets back into the whole, red coat versus blue coat. What you inevitably end up getting is not just shortages. What you inevitably end up getting is a destruction of the world of quality. You end up destroying creativity in the marketplace because everything's reduced to numbers. It's the reign of quantity, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and look at this next article.
Lest ye forget.
Yeah. All right. So this has to do with, okay, great. So again, the Soviet Union implemented this. We talked a little bit about how they organized with Gosplan. Now we're going into what sort of impact did it have on food, clothing, and health. All right. These economic shortcomings made day-to-day life in the Soviet Union less than desirable. The average shirt you wear to work costs 10% of an average monthly wage. A bargain at just 170 pounds. That's the English guy. Which, when translated into present-day UK figures, a winter coat to protect you from the Russian cold, a whole month's salary, which might explain why almost a quarter of the Soviet population couldn't afford one. When it gets to your lunch break, you only have to queue for a few hours before you enjoy twice as many potatoes as the equivalent American, although you have to make do with half as much meat. Want to keep your leftovers in the fridge? You only have to wait a few years for one. Don't miss your 1 hour collection slot, though. You won't get a second chance. If you want to drive home from work rather than shiver in your 170-pound shirt because you can't afford a winter coat, you'll have to wait up to 10 years for a car. There were only 5 million cars in the USSR in 1976. Americans owned nearly 100 million. At some point during your 10-year wait for a car, you might fall ill. Bad luck. The Soviet healthcare system was atrocious, which is crazy because it was universal and free, right? There were 30 times as many cases of typhoid, 20 times as many cases of measles, and cancer detection rates were half as good as in the U.S. And when compared to other developing countries, the USSR failed to deliver better healthcare outcomes despite having the highest physician-patient ratio in the world, 42 per 10,000 per population. While you'd be able to see a qualified physician, the quality of healthcare left a lot to be desired. Many medical school graduates were not even able to read an electrocardiogram. Back in the USSR explores in full detail the consequences of central planning are dire. Communism promised utopia, but delivered nastier, poorer, and shorter lives. And again, we see the same thing. It's not as if the Soviet planners weren't operating based off of maximizing altruism. The problem is that if you didn't have the right inputs with respect to prices, if you didn't have consumers able to actually affect those prices through their demand, right? You lost that critical information, and it couldn't be replaced by smarter people, better quote information, or nicer central planners. Let's look at this last one on the Soviet Union that I want to talk about, because this one is really interesting. So the title of this one was basically the Soviet Union relied heavily on the West for technological innovation. Heavily. How heavily? The key finding of this exhaustively documented historical survey, based on literally hundreds of official and unofficial Western and Soviet sources and abounding in statistical charts, tables, and footnotes and appendices, was that 90% of all Soviet technology was of Western origin. To explain this finding in more detail, Dr. Sutton examined 75 major technological processes in such crucial and diverse sectors as mining, oil, chemicals, machine building, aircraft, communications, agricultural equipment, etc., and estimated the percentage that originated in Russia. The startling results were between 1917 and 1930, 0%. Between 1930 and 1945, only 10%. And between 1945 and 1965, a mere 11%. While there were some indigenous Soviet advances between 1930 and 1945 in the development of machine guns, synthetic rubber, oil drilling techniques, and boilers, such advances were temporary and later abandoned in favor of foreign designs and processes. Between 1946 and 1965, most of the progress of Soviet innovation depended on the scalping of existing plants and technologies imported and copied from the West. This was particularly the case in iron and steel making, electricity generation, and rocket technology. One of the things that's interesting, we also see this within China. One of the biggest problems that we've had, people talk about the innovation within China. So much of that is rooted off of a couple of things. One, direct corporate espionage, right? Technological espionage from the West, where they will take something that the West has already designed or patented and then attempt to develop it, more cheaply. Or they will come up with criteria where if you want to sell a particular product in China, if you want to open it up to the Chinese marketplace, you essentially have to give the Chinese government rights or access to either what would be considered patent protected technology in the United States, or business practices that, again, in the United States would be protected as your private property that you cannot be coerced by the state to share. So once again, if it's working so great, why are they so reliant upon Western free, let's say, more free market economies? You see this all the time with, well, the only reason why the Soviet economy failed was due to Western interference. The only reason why Cuba failed was due to Western sanctions. So let me get this straight. Your system is so incredibly effective and efficient and wonderful for consumers and laborers. It is a worker's utopia. It's so wonderful. But the only way it can exist is that if you're allowed to engage in either economic espionage or open trade from the evil, horrible, greedy, capitalist Western countries.
Oh, I love the quote from socialists about how the only reason Cuba's poor is because of economic sanctions and the embargo from the United States. Whoa. Your utopian system requires its arch enemy to trade with it in order for it to work.
Well, here's a question. Let's say they're making the argument, well, Cuba's so small and it has limited resources. It's an island nation, so of course it's going to need to be able to engage in trade for a greater complex economy. Okay, what's Russia's excuse? What was the Soviet Union's excuse? They didn't have one.
What's
China's excuse? They don't have one. So let me get this straight. The mean, evil, greedy, horrible system, which actually does provide proper price inputs, that system doesn't need Soviet-style economies in order to function and flourish. Doesn't need them at all. But the Soviet-style systems need the free market economic systems in order to flourish? Don't you think that's maybe something of a repudiation of your economic theory? If it actually requires the antithesis of it in order to sustain itself and operate?
You actually had in large parts of the history of the Soviet Union, you actually had Soviet regulators like Gosplan and stuff like that were actually copying Western prices.
Yeah, they would take the Sears Roebuck catalog to use it to establish prices.
That was the only way. That was their only answer to the calculation problem, right? Which was, we'll just copy the prices that exist in the capitalist West. Yes. Where none of these
problem solved, comrade.
That's probably the only reason it even
lasted
survived as long as it did is because they were
if the entire world had adopted a Soviet model, you would have had just systemic economic collapse. Yeah. You would have had the eradication of quality first off, which is what we were talking about earlier, and you would have had economic stagnation and ultimately collapse. What you would have done is you would have sped run the crisis of the Roman Empire under the reign of Diocletian. With his edict on the maximum of prices, where you ended up having just total economic collapse. This was near the tail end of the crisis of the 3rd century. Yeah. Or you would have the situation that the French Republic had when the Jacobins were in charge, and they had price controls that were imposed as well. This is why, it is hilarious how the central planners that demand, that say things like, profit is theft and prices are a form of exploitation. It's hilarious that they need a capitalist model for them to steal from and copy from in order for them to even get close to the type of efficiency that you end up having in freer markets. And I say freer markets because in the West, we don't have a perfectly free market. You don't have a perfect system where prices are a pure manifestation of information, because we do have regulations. We do have limited price controls. In fact, there was a super chat that was put in by Connor recently, where he said, Christian, in your opinion, what role, if any, do regulations and regulatory bodies play in a free market? For example, permitting for building developers. So Connor's in Canada. Yeah. In fact, he was in Vancouver recently. And I think he already knows this, but for the audience that's listening, we actually did a Y-Minute on this topic recently. Did you know that apparently it costs more in permitting from the government in order to get permission to begin building a house? Nothing else has been done. You haven't acquired any materials. You haven't hired any contractors. You haven't even bought the land yet. It takes more in permitting costs to get government permission to build a house in Vancouver than it does to buy a house in the United States.
Yeah. And then you wonder, and then those same government planners, which have required all of this for various environmental policies or equity policies or DEI policies, because all that factors into price. This is another thing that governments seem to be oblivious to, is that every time you do this, you are causing the price to essentially go up in some way because there's an extra level of bureaucracy I now have to comply with. And a lot of times what regulators will do is they'll make themselves feel better by saying, oh, well, it's only $20 and we get to insure this. No, it's $20 to pay it. If for some reason I forget, because this was never something that was required of me, let's say the last 10 years I was doing something, now all of a sudden the compliance issues could issue everything from enormous fees. You could shut down production. You could create a circumstance where now I could, theoretically go bankrupt because of liability issues. Like there's any number of things that if the only thing you're calculating is the good intention that you had as the legislator or the regulator, well then, yeah, you might not see any real cost associated with that. What's the big deal? Yeah, what's the big deal if everything performs exactly the way that you thought it should and intended it to? But that's not the way things operate. Right. And I've been in this situation before where I remember the first time I actually started a business and I thought, my gosh, I am more afraid of not doing some sort of compliance with the IRS I wasn't aware of, or not doing some sort of compliance with some state law that I wasn't aware of, than I am with not being able to find customers. And ultimately, the little regulation of the law, what you end up finding out is that more often than not, it's superfluous. Nobody cares, except for the politician that wanted to be able to go home and say, I did this.
And it's effectively hidden from the consumer.
Yes.
So these are all back-end costs that the consumer doesn't even recognize is happening. Like most people, they are consumers and employees. They have absolutely no idea how much tax is paid on their behalf in their, when you pay tax, your employer pays a tax on your tax as well. There are a lot of things that your employer is required to do for you. Same with builders and things like that. And so what we see on our end as a consumer is, wow, these prices are insane. This guy must be greedy. Yes. And then the government steps in and goes, you're right, that guy's greedy. And that's why those prices are so high. Yeah. It's him. He's greedy. Yeah. And it's an easy sell for anybody who is not either does not own their own business, isn't an entrepreneur, or is just an employee. And I don't mean to say just an employee, but there is, you don't know what you don't know.
There's different knowledge considerations.
If you don't have the experience in that area, it's easy to think that they pay exactly what you pay. Well, they don't. Yeah. They don't. And they take a lot more risk as well.
Oh, yeah. Barbara, thank you for the super chat. She goes, what about we buy goods that come in a package and that is reflected in the price? We pay for garbage pickup and have to pay for recycling. The company sells the package to other companies that use in their product. Yeah, it's this idea that, again, the economy is fairly complex because there's so many different people factoring in different decisions based off of different preferences, different need, wants, and demands, all of those things. And again, the entrepreneur plays an incredibly important role. Like the socialists love to pass off the entrepreneur as just the greedy person that's operating off of other people's labor. No, the entrepreneur is the one that's actually coordinating the risk factors in all of this. Not to mention the fact that the entrepreneur, either through their own labor or through the labor of investors, decided to take a portion of their labor and instead of just spending it on consumer goods or entertainment, they decided to buy something that would help them produce something better. Now, here's my question, especially for some of the people that are like, oh, global unions will solve all of this. Look, I don't have a problem theoretically with unions. I have a problem with the government intervening on behalf of one side or the other within this economic exchange. But here's what I would ask you. Does the laborer want to get the most they possibly can? Does the laborer want the highest wage possible for their work? Yes. Do we ever say, oh, that greedy laborer is causing prices to go up for consumer goods? No. Because most of us are familiar with being the person that wants to make the most we possibly can for our labor. It's a perfectly self-interested thing to want to do. It is just as equally valid for an entrepreneur to want to be able to get the most out they possibly can out of their business with the goods or services they're providing. They both play important functions. But here's what I would ask the laborer to think about, to contemplate. If you don't think you're getting the max value for your labor, which is to say, well, this company is getting a profit off of my labor. Okay, well then why don't you just stop working for them and go work for yourself? Why don't you produce the same thing that you're currently producing and then just compete with them? Well, I don't have the factory, or I don't have the capital goods, or I don't have the advertising budget, or I don't have the built-in consumer. Oh, so you're exploiting those things that your employer brings to the table in order to make your labor more valuable. Oh, you evil exploit. No. You're engaged in a voluntary transaction. Your labor is made more valuable by working for the person that actually has invested in the building and the capital and the advertising and the customer base. You now don't have to build all of that because they've already built it. Your labor is more valuable working for them than it is working for yourself. That's why you do it. But you don't get to come back later and then punch that guy or gal in the face. Like, how dare you get a profit off of my labor? Like, whoa, 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 whoa. You're getting a salary based off of, in part off of my labor.
But
that's why it's cooperative.
He didn't build that. Do you remember Obama being like, you got a business, you got a house, you got a this, you got that? You didn't build that.
Yeah.
And it's this whole idea that anybody who has something that they are risking in order to build up a company or whatever it may be, you didn't really build that. You built that on the backs of everybody else. And it's because you had a silver spoon in your mouth, your family gave you money or whatever. And those numbers don't pan out actually because most people aren't starting off with inherited wealth. And even very wealthy people, most of them did not start off with inherited wealth. No. But it's a weird misnomer that people actually think that, oh, well, if you're rich, your family's always been rich. But most rich people are first generation rich.
Yeah. Well, let's look into this. All right. Because now the complaint might be, well, Nick, sure, you're cherry picking stats from the USSR. All right. Let's look at the next article. Okay, so we're going to go right here to the wonderful United States of America to demonstrate that, once again, we are definitely a freer economy than most of the world, but we're not a totally free market economy, right? Every economy operates to some degree off of a mixed economy, but some are definitely in the category of being more socialist. Some are in the category of being freer. The United States, last time I checked, ranks about 25th based off of the Economic Freedom Index that Heritage puts out. Fraser Institute has one that's similar. The U.S. scores pretty much around that 2020 slot. All right. But this talks about price controls that happen here in the United States under a Republican. Just so you know, I'm more than happy to trash Republicans as well when they do bad stuff. For older Americans, the price control debate is nothing new. In August of 1971, President Richard Nixon announced a 90-day freeze on most wages, prices, and rents. It was a short-sighted attempt to combat the rise of consumer prices that had reached their fastest pace since the Korean War. Following Nixon's announcement, markets rallied and 70% of Americans backed the plan in polls. However, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman predicted Nixon's plan would end in, quote, utter failure and the emergence into the open of the suppressed inflation. As predicted, prices soared as soon as controls were lifted, exposing the frailty of government interference with pricing. Among the many bizarre and tragic consequences of Nixon's price controls was the appalling specter of farmers drowning millions of baby chicks or gassing them. As the price for chickens was controlled, but the price of the grain used to feed them was not, they could no longer be sold profitably. Sadly, this meant that the only way for the farmers to avoid losses was to kill them. This is but one example of the unintended consequences of excessive government intervention that prevents market forces from operating. So again, you wouldn't think that, right? You wouldn't think to yourself, well, the government's setting prices to try to make your gas cheaper, to try to make, that's just going to help things. Nope. Grain was still high. Selling chickens was low. The end result was, honestly, the humane thing at that point was farmers to kill millions of baby chicks because it was too expensive to feed them.
I have two questions, though. What would you say to the socialist who would respond to this story with simply, oh, well, you know, as predicted, prices soared as soon as controls were lifted, exposing the frailty of government interference with pricing. The socialist might respond and say, this is why you shouldn't lift the price controls. Yeah. The second point is that reading this part, but as the price for chickens was controlled, but the price of grain used to feed them was not.
Just
the socialists might just say, why don't you just control the price for grain as well? How do you respond to those 2 points?
It's called shortages because that's what ends up happening. Like, again, prices are not arbitrary things that the government is simply just setting because they feel like it, right? Well, actually, that is exactly what the government's doing. They're treating prices as if they're arbitrary, right? When in reality, prices are a reflection, regardless of what you like or don't like. Prices are a reflection of what is actually going on in the economy at the time based off of supply and demand, access to resources, things of that nature. And so when you say, oh, well, the solution to this is just to keep the price of grain low. All right, well, now you have to take it one more step. So this step one was, we're going to make chickens cheaper. All right, well, now I can't afford to keep the chickens because I'm not getting enough money to sell them, so I got to kill them. Because, well, why? because grain prices are too high. Oh, okay, grain prices are low. Well, now the grain farmer's like, well, okay, now I can't afford to actually sell the grain at a level that would allow me to replenish my stock of seed and pay my laborers and the equipment and everything else. So I'm going to stop growing, or I'm going to grow something else. Well, why? Well, because the price of seed and the price of labor. Okay, great. We'll reduce the price of seed. Okay, well, now the people selling seeds are like, well, if I can't sell the price of seeds, I'm going to stop selling. Like, it's this infinite regression, because again, the farmers didn't want to kill millions of baby chicks. They wanted to sell them as chickens for hungry people, right? Hungry people didn't want to go hungry, right? But the bottom line is that if you're not accurately reflecting the cost of what's going on in the economy to bring that chicken to your table, you're not going to get a cheaper chicken. You're going to get shortages, because now people don't have the incentive anymore. What am I supposed to do? Produce at a loss? Is that what I'm supposed to do?
Ultimately,
yes.
That's
ultimately,
what
it is. Ultimately, and again, here's the irony: the same Marxists that claim that the end stage of capitalism was that you would pay your employer to work for them. No, that's what happens when you engage in price controls and central planning. You are now forcing me with machine guns to continue to produce at a loss when I wouldn't otherwise do that. That's what you're forcing to do. You guys are the ones guilty of the very thing that you claimed late stage capitalism would be guilty of. It is an absolute, again, it's one of those things where, what's the terminology? Accusation becomes confession. Right. All right, let's get this one right here. Lance, thank you for the super chat. Saw a tweet from Nick. Can you all explain the South flip thing? I'd be happy to do that. It's not really relevant to this particular podcast, so I will certainly be happy to do that. It might be a discussion we can have over in our circle chat. I appreciate the super chat, but we really do try to keep the questions on the topic at hand. So needless to say, there is an explanation for this. No, the South didn't, the parties didn't switch, right? There's the evidence of that is horrible. It comes from a kind of a manipulation of just superficial data as opposed to actually looking at what actually took place. So there is an answer to it. A lot of people have answered it very well. Dinesh D'Souza answers it very, very well if you want to check out his response. And we'd be happy to do it maybe in a later episode, but not right now with this one. So thank you. Next one. Let's go. Okay, so here's what we're going to go to next. So I hope we've done a good job of explaining, like, look, there is a 4,000-year history of this not working, and the reason it doesn't work is because everything that we already explained about what prices actually are, the important role that they play, the economic calculation problem, and the knowledge problem. Now we're going to get into but what about this, right? What about minimum wages, though? But what about the price of insulin? Nick, surely you cannot think it is appropriate for Eli Lilly to take something like insulin, the patent of which was sold in the 1920s for $1, and be charging people $380 a month for life-saving medication that they will literally die without. Surely, Nick, you cannot believe the price controls aren't necessary there. We're going to answer these two questions right now. Let's start with the minimum wage. All right, so let's go to this first article about the minimum wage. Next one.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah. Okay. So we've got a couple of things here. The important thing to understand about the minimum wage is what it is and what it isn't. So the minimum wage, as we discussed before, is a price floor. It says you are not allowed to pay a laborer, under this amount, like per hour, unless sometimes there's cutouts or there's economic set-asides. So traditionally in the United States, we've had ones for agriculture. Some of that's based off of trying to keep food prices low. Isn't it interesting that one of the efforts to keep food prices low is to not allow the minimum wage to increase? The other thing, it shows that they actually do understand how prices work. The other thing that we see is selective cutouts in places like California, where they were doing a $20 minimum wage. And what was the end result of that $20 minimum wage? Well, it turns out that people are firing people. In fact, I'm sorry, Christian, you were right. Go back to that.
Yeah, $20 minimum wage for people that flip burgers, like unskilled labor. $20 minimum wage.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that, again, the central planner advocates, the socialists, the advocates, a lot of the activists within modern day unions will say, well, there's no such thing as unskilled labor. Okay.
Yes, there is.
Fine. No, there's some labor. All labor requires some sort of like basic motor function, right? But we can at least agree that the amount of training and expertise and knowledge required to work at fast food is not the same as, let's say, heart surgery.
Sure.
Can we agree that there are varying degrees of complexity
If
within
it's
the labor.
something that anybody could be trained in 2 afternoons to do, it's unskilled labor.
Or let's just say it's low-skilled labor, right? Low-skilled labor. Restaurant franchises such as Chipotle, Jack in the Box, and McDonald's have already announced they'll be jacking up prices to cover increased labor costs, which are expected to be increased by roughly $250,000 per location for many of these restaurants. But raising menu prices isn't the only way California restaurants are responding. Records submitted to the state show Pizza Hut and Round Table Pizza plan to sack nearly 1,300 delivery drivers. Other chains are taking similar actions, and many restaurants have stopped hiring new workers. This is not unexpected. Critics of the law predicted it would result in less employment, and that's exactly what has happened. California had 726,600 people working in fast food and other limited service eateries in January. The Wall Street Journal reports down 1.3% from last September when the state backed a deal for the increased wages. This is not the only way restaurants will reduce labor costs, of course. Benefit cuts, fewer hours, and shift toward automation are also on the table, but the layoffs at California restaurants are what is currently generating the most attention, and for good reason. We have had this in Virginia. We've had this debate in Virginia, and it always works the same way. Everybody that wants to raise the minimum wage cares about poor people, and everybody that points out obvious economic problems with it are just evil, mean, greedy people that don't care about the poor. I want to use a story of this to illustrate this point. I had a group of students come into my class, come into my office down in Richmond. So a group of students, they came in, they go, Delegate Freitas, they were there for agriculture, future farmers of America. The Delegate Freitas, what is some of the legislation that will have the greatest impact on agriculture? I said, well, if completed in the form that they want, it'll actually be the minimum wage. It won't have anything to do with some of the things we're looking at, nutrients or water or best, land management practices. It will be the minimum wage. And so I asked this group of students, how many people, what percentage of the labor force in America do you think is making minimum wage right now? And the average between all of their responses was roughly, they thought 30 to 40% of the labor force was making minimum wage. Now, if you want to talk about the work of, the good work of propaganda on behalf of the left, to convince the average student to honestly believe that 30 to 40% of the labor force is making minimum wage, that is about as good as you can get, because what is the actual number? It's about 2%. 2% of the labor market. So I asked them, I said, actually it's 2%. They're like, whoa. I said, so let me ask you this question. Out of that 2% of the labor market that is making minimum wage, do you think the average person making it is older, middle-aged, younger? And all of a sudden the wheels start turning, probably younger. I'm like, why do you think that is? Well, because younger people do more of the fast food jobs and kind of, entry-level stuff. Yeah. I said, okay, good. Yeah, that's accurate. That is accurate. A plurality of people making minimum wage are under 25 years of age. Okay, here's my next question. Of those people making minimum wage, right, that 2% of the population, maybe 3% on some years, what percentage do you think will be making minimum wage if they stay in the current job that they're in for at least 6 months? And they're like, well, pretty low. I'm like, yes, you're correct. If they stay within that job, actually it's more like 3 months, but if they stay within that job for 6 months, chances are they will no longer be making minimum wage. Why do you think that is? Well, because now they know more about doing the actual work. Yes, their labor has increased in value. It is now easier to pay them a little bit more money than it is to try to hire someone new to replace them. Right? That's why. Right? So let me ask this question. So if we roughly have 2% of the labor force always making minimum wage, and it's predominantly young people who immediately graduate out of making more than minimum wage in a short period of time, why do you think the minimum wage, why do you think the percentage of people making minimum wage stays the same? Well, because you have a constant influx of new people. Yes. So now we just explained all of it. I said, now I want to ask you this question. If I, as the government, just come in and say, I have decided that the minimum wage should now be this, and in Virginia we were doubling it within 5 years, practically doubling it, what do you think happens? Do you think employers are just like, shucks, you got us. We were being super greedy, but now we can't be. We can't be as greedy, and so we got to pay people more. Do you think that's what happens?
No.
Or do you think that there's an impact on prices? Do you think there's an impact
less jobs
on labor? So if I'm now a small business, right, and I have 2 people, and I can only afford to keep one of them at the new rates, I fire one. So yes, the person who maybe kept their job, maybe they're thinking, great, I made more money. Look, it works. But the person who lost their job, it certainly didn't work for them. Or what about the person that says, well, I got to keep both of you because there's no way I can function without these two people. So I guess we're going to have to increase costs. Then you walk into that coffee shop or to that eatery or whatever it is. You're like, oh my gosh, this greedy business owner is charging me more money for that sandwich. Well, yeah, what was the other option? Well, now I'm not going to eat here anymore. Okay, well, now I guess I either fire somebody and I do more of the work or I go out of business. You just arbitrarily increase the cost. If you did this with any other sector of the economy, if the government came in and said, you know what? People are not paying enough for lumber. People need to pay more for lumber so we can help the lumber industry. So now lumber is 100% more expensive than it was 3 years ago. 100% more expensive because we're helping the lumber industry. You'd instantly be like, whoa, wait a second. You're going to make everything more expensive, not just the people that need lumber, but everything that's made with lumber is now more expensive as a result of this. Yes, it turns out it is. Because all you're doing is arbitrarily manipulating a price. When you do it with a commodity like lumber, everyone's like, hey, dumbass, what are you doing? But when you do it with labor and you say, no, this is about the people. Oh, okay, it's about the people. But nothing changes the fact that that person's productivity didn't increase by 100% or 25% or 50%. They didn't produce more output. There's not more goods and services as a result of you actually doing this. You just made the existing goods and services more expensive. You're not a hero. And since demand curves slope downward, which means as something gets more expensive, there's less demand for it, you just made entry-level workers more expensive to hire. You did none of the things that you advertised. All you did, and I pointed this out before in floor debates. I said, I look at this bill and you talk about how you're going to help working families and how you're going to increase the standard of living for poor people. And I look at the bill and I'm looking at the language here and you know what? There's nothing in there that says that. Nothing in the text of this bill actually says, yep, and then we're going to guarantee, greater standard of living for people. No. You know what it does do? Explicitly. No doubt whatsoever. No marketing, no advertising, just legally. What does it do? Well, it makes someone in Lee County, Virginia, it makes it illegal for them to pay them $12.99 an hour. That's what it does. In fact, it's the only thing it does. So even though the median individual income in a particular county in Southwest Virginia is about $30,000 a year, which means $12.99 an hour in a full-time job is not a bad gig, especially when you know that 6 months into it, you're going to be making more. What you just told them is, you should be unemployed. Why? Because I'm nice. Well, God bless you, arrogant ass politician. What do you think you've really done for that person? What do you think? Now let's say they keep their job. See, I've helped them. But now the price of all the consumer goods associated with their labor has gone up. And now they can't even afford as much on the increased pay that you've given them as a result of price manipulations.
You know what they think they've done? They've just won re-election. That's what they think they've done.
And this why it goes to Thomas Sowell's famous quote about how it's not that politicians don't want to solve problems. It's just the primary problem they want to solve is how do they get reelected. And that doesn't necessarily include doing what's best for you. It's doing whatever helps them get additional votes. And to Tina's point, when you show up to the coffee shop and you're furious that the sandwich that you've always bought for $6 is now $7.50, you don't say, this must be a result of the government manipulating prices through taxes, subsidization, or regulation, or price controls. No. This must be the greedy business owner. I know nothing about everything they had to do in order to deliver this sandwich to me at this price, but I'm going to go ahead and assume that because it costs more now, it must be greed. That's the only possible explanation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you this question. If you think entrepreneurs are greedy, what makes you think politicians are somehow less greedy or immune from the same vice? Because if politicians are at least as greedy as the entrepreneurs they're constantly regulating on your behalf, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that, maybe some of these politicians can also be motivated by greed? Maybe their greed comes in the form of the concentration of power and authority in their hands as a result of your vote. And maybe they have a perverse incentive to trick you into voting for them by telling you things that might sound good but don't actually work well as long as they have someone to blame for the consequences of it. Is that at least not a theory worth considering? I think it's certainly one we should consider before we give them more power.
I think that the biggest problem that we have on this front, and there was a comment in our live chat about this. Somebody said, this was like maybe 30 minutes ago, I know this, like, we were talking about shortages, the knowledge problem, the economic calculation problem, price controls. And this person in the chat said, I know this. Obviously, you guys know this. How do we get other people to know this? Because it goes back to the point that I just brought up earlier that, no, they are solving a problem.
Yeah.
What they think they've accomplished is their re-election bid. And I mean, ultimately, it goes back to Thomas Sowell's quote, right? That the fact that so many politicians are such shameless liars is not just a damning indictment of them. It's a damning indictment of us, because we're the ones that elect them. And when I say us, I mean, I've never voted for a Democrat in my life, but it's the public at large, right? It's democracy in action. And the end of that Sowell quote is, when the people demand the impossible, only liars can suffice. The problem that we have is that people demand utopia. People demand utopia. People demand no shortages of anything, no limitations on prices of anything. And as Thomas Sowell also brings up, the first law of economics is scarcity. Yeah. There's never enough of everything to satisfy all needs, all wants. We do not live in a post-scarcity society, and we never will.
Yeah, there's no such thing.
There is no such thing. There will always be something that somebody wants that they don't yet have. Now, maybe there's a means for them to get that thing at some point through hard work or innovation or investment, but there'll always be shortages. We don't exist in a post-scarcity society. We do not live in heaven. And yet the base desire for people is basically no suffering, no limitations, no shortages, no need for work, no anything, right? Everything just we all want to live in the land of milk and honey, right? Well, and so like the problem, to go back to that question from the live stream, and I want to present it to you, is that like, we know the problem. Our audience knows the problem. Now, there's always things to learn. Like, it was only within the past year that I learned about the details of what the Austrian economists were talking about when it comes to articulating the economic calculation problem and the knowledge problem. But intrinsically, if you have a free market mindset, you know what these issues are. How do you get the voting public who are electing these people, who are imposing price controls, who are imposing minimum wage hikes, who are directly or indirectly imposing shortages?
Yes.
They're imposing Soviet-style command economies, even in a supposedly free market society like the United States. How do we get the general public to know about this? The black pill within me thinks you can't.
Well, no, I disagree. My kids do. My kids know it. It is fascinating to watch my kids. Again, both my daughters are theater kids. Like there's this funny YouTube video I saw about how our country's been taken over by theater kids, and it's showing like Kamala Harris and Gretchen Whitmer and whatnot. And I'm thinking, gosh, both of my daughters are theater kids. They absolutely love the theater, and they've really enjoyed the conversations that they've gotten with people there. Now, and both of them do an excellent job. What's kind of funny is that between my two daughters, Lily is more likely to explain something like I do, even probably a little bit more gentler. Allie is more likely to explain something the way Tina does. So it's more full frontal assault, man. And it's funny to watch both of them explain things because they're using similar arguments but different approaches to it. But here's what I would say. We didn't find it terribly difficult to explain certain economic principles to our kids, because part of what understanding the economy is, and part of the reason why we took time to do it with our kids, is because it's actually really empowering. Once you kind of understand that, yes, there'll always be people motivated by greed. Yes, there'll always be people, motivated by things they shouldn't be motivated by. But the beautiful thing, like the moral thing, this is the important part. The moral thing about the free market system is not that everybody is going to make wonderful decisions. It's not that there won't be mistakes. It's the fact that in a world with scarce resources, with diversity of talents, with diversity of capabilities, you have an opportunity within a free market to figure out what your place is within that thing, where you bring value to others in exchange for value back. And you get to take a certain sense of wholesome pride in your ability to serve the needs of others so effectively that they're willing to actually give you money for it. Right? And then you get to do the same thing. And you guys get to involve in these mutually beneficial transactions where you find somebody that values the talent you have more than the money that they possess, and they have something that you value more than the money you possess, and you exchange. And that's where you get to it. And when you start to explain that, one of the examples that I gave to our children early on when they first got jobs is understand something. You don't own the job. This is one of my biggest problems with some of the some of the discussion that I hear union members, union leaders talk about, like our jobs, like, no, they aren't yours. You have to create the job in order to own the job. What you own is your labor. And you do own that. Nobody should be able to forcefully steal your labor from you. They don't get to do that. You get to voluntarily sell it to them, but they don't get to take it from you.
Except the government.
Except for the government, right? But the idea is that once you start looking at it that way, where it's like you own your labor, that's what you own. You own your labor, you own your talent, you own your personality, you own all those things, and you should go out there and get the best price for it possible. But if you want to own the job, you have to create the opportunity. That's a different mindset. Now, both mindsets are good, right? We need people that are skilled technicians that want to focus so exclusively on what they do or their art or their craft that maybe they don't want to be an entrepreneur. Maybe they don't want to own the storefront. But the entrepreneur that does own that storefront is now putting in their hands an audience, a customer base, advertising, capital tools to make their labor that much more effective. And when you start to see it that way, where it's like, man, you're providing something to me that I don't do well on my own, but enhances what I do. And what I do is enhancing what you do. And we're able to both benefit from this. We're able to both excel, not just monetarily. We're able to also get value and meaning and purpose from the thing that we provide to each other voluntarily. Knowing that each one of us could walk away if we needed to, if we wanted to, if we got a better offer. Like that's not a scary thing. That's an exciting thing when you think about it properly. It's the other side that constantly scare people into thinking that, no, you're being exploited. Anything that you don't have that you want as a result of somebody else exploiting you. But don't worry, give me power and I'll take it from them and give it to you. Ooh, that's tempting, isn't it? To abscond with all sense of personal responsibility for one's circumstances, especially in situations where you might be able to say, yeah, hey, that person had a trust fund. I don't. That's not fair. Well, wait a second. If I work really, really hard to provide opportunities for my children, so that they can start off better than I start off. Isn't that the motivation we want within society? Don't we want one generation to be thinking about how their actions, how their investments, how their behaviors elevate and promote future generations? Don't we want them thinking about that? Or do we want them all thinking from the standpoint of, nope, I better all spend it as much as I can right now on me, on what I want. Even if it's altruistic, it's all got to be gone when I left because I want whoever comes after me to start from zero. Wait a second. All of us are the beneficiaries of labor that we never engaged in, thought that we never engaged in. I got news for everyone here. I did not invent the wheel. Nope. I was the beneficiary of literally millennia's worth of people thinking and working and trying and striving. And here I stand on top of all of their labor, on top of all of their thoughts, having at the moment of my birth contributed nothing to it and yet benefiting from it. Is that a bad thing that I inherited all that? Is that a bad thing that you inherited all that? No. So again, when you start to teach your kids that, hey, look, there's no such thing as perfect equality of outcomes. There's no such thing as a perfectly equal starting point. That can't be achieved. And every time people have tried to achieve it, it's led to bloodshed and murder and totalitarianism and authoritarianism. You don't want those things.
It reminds me of the Margaret Thatcher quote when she got up and she said, you don't mind if the poor get poorer so long as the rich get poorer too. And it's because it's like as long as we're all poor together, that's much better than some people getting rich and some people staying poorer. And part of it's a little bit strange, but that is sort of the mindset that people in society do have right now is all me right now, immediate instant gratification right now. That's why the abortion numbers are what they are. Mm-hmm. It's I'm going to sacrifice this fetus and I may want to be a mom someday, but I'm going to sacrifice this particular child for my career. I'm going to sacrifice this particular child for this sport that I love to do, or so that my parents don't get mad at me, or so that I'm accepted in society, or so that I can stay more comfortable because my financial situation's a little bit better for one person than it is for two. And God forbid you be told that maybe you shouldn't be having sex outside of wedlock when you're at an age where you can't support a child. No, because it's all my gratification right now. It's all me.
Do you guys remember that email that Steve Jobs sent to himself?
Yes.
He sent it 14 years ago to the day, actually. And it's a short email. I'm going to read it off because it when you were speaking, Nick, a minute ago, it just reminded me of it. He said, I grow little of the food I eat, and of the little I do grow, I do not breed or perfect the seeds. I do not make any of my own clothing. I speak a language I did not invent or refine. I did not discover the mathematics I use. I am protected by freedoms and laws I did not conceive of or legislate, and do not enforce or adjudicate. I am moved by music I did not create myself. When I needed medical attention, I was helpless to help myself survive. I did not invent the transistor, the microprocessor, object-oriented programming, or most of the technology I work with. I love and admire my species, living and dead, and am totally dependent on them for my life and well-being. Sent from my iPad.
Well, I think another way to look at this, we got one more thing we want to address here, and that's the price of insulin, because I think it's an important one to address. But one more thing too that I think is important to the question that was asked about how do you teach future generations about that? How do you educate people on it? One example I used to like to tell people, and that I think I've expressed this to the kids as well, was there's two ways to look at success. Your neighbor's success. There's two ways to look at your neighbor's success. You can look at it with envy, or you can look at it with hope. So if you look at it with envy, then you don't celebrate their success. You look for ways to justify why it's unearned and why you should have it instead. If you look at it with hope, you celebrate with them, because their success represents not only their ability to have done something good that improved their lives, but in some way it can also potentially represent your ability to do the same thing. And it's kind of the difference between looking at something through envy and gratitude. I don't want to ever look at my neighbor's success as a source of envy. I want to look at it as not only a representation of them doing something good that benefited their lives and celebrate with them, but I also want to look at it with hope that, you know what, I can figure that out too. And it is a completely different mindset. And here's what I'll tell you, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, the more time you invest in being envious of what somebody else has had, either because of real or perceived injustice, the less happy it is going to make you in the long run, and the less effective it's going to make you. It is truly incredible to me that I have met people that were born into life with every conceivable advantage that completely squandered all of it. I have met other people that were born with every conceivable disadvantage who turned their lives into something truly remarkable. And the difference between the two was one saw the world through a sense of entitlement, and one saw the world through a sense of gratitude and opportunity. And it's led me to the conclusion that victim mentality, whether it's justified or not, victim mentality never serves you well. Never. The person that sees opportunity, the person that operates through gratitude, regardless of the circumstances, will almost always make things better for themselves and the people around them. Well, the people living in envy always do the opposite. And there doesn't seem to be any getting around it. No matter how much moral justification they try to throw out, even when they do have some good grounds to feel the way that they do, the mindset that they take into it will impact everything going forward. And they always end up being the most miserable. No matter how miserable they want their neighbor to be, they end up being more miserable. All right, let's go into this last one, because I think it's probably the most effective use case for price controls, and that has to do with insulin prices. So let's go ahead and throw up this article here. Is it that one? Nope, next one.
Next one.
All right, so we got a tweet here from Bernie Sanders. The inventors of insulin sold its patent for $1. Eli Lilly now charges $360 a month for the drug and made $3.2 billion in profits last year. Meanwhile, Americans must sell all their possessions to get the insulin they need. We're going to take on the greed of the drug industry. Now, nothing that he said there as far as the patent being sold, what Eli Lilly charges, the profits they made, even the fact that some Americans are desperate because they have to do this. It's a survival thing. This is the best, I would argue, best possible case for price controls you could ever advocate for, that you could ever use, and yet it's still wrong. And the question people have is like, okay, but why? Surely, Nick, this can't be the case. Come on. In this case, doesn't it make sense? I get every other case. I accept every other case. But in this case, it has to make sense. It still doesn't, because nothing has changed about the fundamentals. Now, let me add something here. Is it true that it was sold for $1? Yes. Is it true that I think Eli Lilly charging $360 a month for a drug made is ridiculous given that reality, along with some other realities that we're going to discuss here similar around this? Yes. Is it ridiculous that they would make $3.2 billion in profits off of such an enormous price hack on something that there just isn't a great deal of justification for? Yeah, that's strange. That's strange. But it should cause you to ask the question. See, Bernie Sanders didn't ask any important questions. He just said, greed, and we're going to deal with it. Well, how do you plan to deal with it, Bernie? Price caps. Okay, but are you asking any important questions about why the price for that is that high? Or are you just saying, we're going to do the price caps? And the thing is that he's actually given a brilliant political response, because the brilliant political response, and I know as someone who is in politics, who has run for office, who has had consultants talking to me, it's like, Nick, you just got to deal with the issue that the person is dealing with at the kitchen table. And the deal that they're issuing with at the kitchen table is not an understanding of the economic calculation problem. The deal that they're going with is, do I buy food or insulin? And Bernie Sanders just said you're going to be able to buy both. And you want to give a longer explanation. The answer is yes, I do. Because crap explanations and crap public policy leads to horrible results. Bernie Sanders is solving his problem. How do I get elected and concentrate more power in my hands? He's not solving the problem of the person that needs insulin.
Well, you know, Bernie Sanders would be solving the problem for the people who need insulin with all of his if only all of his policies went into place, we would have famine again, which would take care of type 2 diabetes, which is 95% of the insulin consumption is type 2. It is weight related, you guys, 95%. So you've got people that I'm looking right at the numbers, 90 to 95%. So you've got 5% of people who need this to live from birth, who they were born with this. It's through zero fault of themselves or their parents. They just genetically have this. And then you have people who have a disposition that is more likely to get it if certain parameters are in place. Like, for instance, certain eating habits, certain lifestyle choices, certain things like that. And so if Bernie Sanders did have his way, babe, people would be starving, which would take care of most of the insulin problem.
Well, I do think it's an we could talk about the food pyramid and how actually the American government has actually fostered greater obesity as a result of their recommendations and then the negative influences. But I want to get to the main point of this, though. And the main point of this is not whether it's type 2 diabetes, type 1. The main point of this is right here. And it goes in the article. Amid this cesspool of indignant commentary, you're likely to hear one of the biggest misconceptions around that markets, competition, or capitalism have failed to respond to the patient's needs in creating more affordable insulin. What you won't hear is how pharma giants have enlisted the FDA, the DEA, the FBI, Customs and Border Security, and a dozen other taxpayer-funded regulatory and enforcement agencies to protect their profit margins. If anything, the draconian constraints demonstrate just how diligently market competition brings down prices and how hamstrung and hogtied competition must be before it stops performing its essential functions. When studying markets, economists like to imagine hypothetical perfect competition, the economic equivalent of physics frictionless plane. In perfect competition, many suppliers and demanders exchange the same product. Buyers and sellers can find each other and switch products without added cost, and no barriers prevent new supplies from entering the market to offer equivalent goods. If a perfect competition market is the hypothetical free market heaven, the American insulin market is literal hell. And he goes on to 3 reasons why it is the government, not markets, not capitalism. It is the government which is actually causing insulin to be so high. And the government could solve it. Bernie Sanders could solve all this. And yet, he doesn't really want to do any of the things that would be necessary to do that. Why is that? Well, because it would include less power for government regulatory agencies. So, step 1, limit the number of suppliers. Even though insulin treatment itself can't be patented, improvements in delivery mechanisms can be. These incremental improvements, no matter how small, can be used to extend the 20-year patent on a drug, a process called patent evergreening. Sanofi has filed 74 patent applications on its long-acting insulin Lantus, nearly all of them after the drug was on the market and boxed out generics for decades. Drug makers seek extensions to this exclusivity when they add pill coatings and alter inactive ingredients, extending their monopoly but offering no marginal advantage to patents or to patients. Regulators and farmer CEOs aren't opposing forces. They are the same people, sometimes literally. Nearly half of staff reviewers at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration will go on to take jobs in the industries they're tasked with regulating, often as advisors in navigating regulatory policy. Research involving the revolving door phenomenon was summarized by one scholar. When you know 60% of your colleagues who leave go to work for the industry, it may make you more likely to be the kind of regulator that gets along well with the industry, helps them shepherd drugs through, and doesn't push too hard on the warts in a trial. Step 2, exclude competing products. Even when cheaper analogs have been approved by regulators in Canada or Europe and outcomes are clinically indistinguishable for most patients, the FDA drags its feet for years. Innovators and biomedical researchers faced with insurmountable costs are likely to drop a new project or sell it to an existing giant with the legal staff to carry the load. That legal team, remember, includes several former FDA staffers, more than capable of burying a potential competitor in a decade of official busy work. There's more to all of these, but I'm just getting the highlights. Step 3, hide and distort prices so no one can shop around. Bernie, if you really wanted to do something, here's what you would do. Patients and indeed prescribers have only the foggiest idea of what products are available and their real per unit cost. Manufacturers like to boast that no one pays, quote, list price. Patients rely on a patchwork of health insurance, pharmacy discounts, and manufacturer rebates to bring the cost within reach. Such a complicated framework provides a wide scope for manipulation. Prices paid by patients have risen steadily for a decade, but the price paid by healthcare actors has fallen. Pharma companies steeply discount the negotiated prices paid by pharmacies, benefits directors, and health insurers. Insulin is pre-priced as many as 4 times other than the list price before it can be purchased by a consumer. At each stage, the reimbursement is based on a percentage of the list price. So the higher the list price, the better the returns for each participant in the process, even if no patient ever pays the list price. They have set up this Byzantine structure where everybody is getting to take a cut. Why? Not because that would naturally exist within the market. They've done it because government regulations, the very people telling you that they are going to solve your problem by capping prices. Why don't they solve our problem by getting rid of this? Why don't they solve our problem by doing that? Well, that would include less power and influence for them over the markets. That's why. It's very simple. Now, is every politician that sees this simply motivated by greed? Some are. Some are just motivated by, again, what does it take to get me elected? This sounds good. And because it gets them elected and it sounds good and it makes them feel good, there is no need to go into greater questioning of the thought process, especially if your entire political party and an entire base of voters surrounding it are telling you, no, that's the problem I want solved. Solve it this way. Well, then you have full electoral and moral justification to just solve it this way. Simplest solution, right? Solves every problem. Your problem, you feel better about your insulin prices, even though we actually haven't addressed the underlying issues, and the problems will continue to mount over time. But that will be some other politician's problem. But in the meantime, I get to do the most obvious thing, which is the easiest to sell, fits on a bumper sticker, I get reelected, and these same regulatory agencies and these same companies now have an incentive to come to me to make sure that they are sending out the proper campaign donations, right? So which one of these systems do you want? Do you want a system where you can just arbitrarily throw up price controls? Because here's the bad news. Prices are artificially inflated because of what the government has done. The government is now saying, okay, but we're going to cap the prices to a certain amount. They're never going to cap it more than the pharmaceutical industry will allow them to cap it, because then it would result in shortages. And then the government is going to price, what they're going to either do is they're going to cap it, or they're going to release the cap, and then you know what they're going to do? They're going to subsidize on the other end. So either way, you're paying, baby, but you're not paying directly, not like you do for the vast majority of products that you buy. No. You're paying through a tax structure. You're paying through a Byzantine regulatory structure that, by the way, your taxes also have to finance.
It's a hidden tax.
Yeah.
It's similar to inflation in that respect. Nick, I know that we're at the end of the episode. There's a couple of super chats that I wanted your take on that in some ways are actually quite relevant to what we were just talking about with shortages. The first one that we got in today's episode is talking about Argentina. And Evodio says, I think just recently, President Milei abolished rent control in Argentina. As a result, instead of rental prices skyrocketing, they all dropped. Well, the reason why this might sound like contradictory. How could prices drop if you drop the rent controls? Because aren't the rent controls actually putting a floor for prices, or sorry, a ceiling for prices?
Yeah.
And so if you lift it, wouldn't the prices actually rise? Because the only thing that's preventing the prices from rising is that ceiling. Well, what's interesting is that, and you know, Ireland has this problem too right now. Ireland and the UK, especially Ireland though, has a huge problem on this front when it comes to housing as well. What you've done by setting rent control prices, and in Ireland's case, it's not just rent control. They actually have massive crackdowns on things like Airbnbs, on the real estate market in general, is what you've done is again, you've distorted information. You have to start thinking about prices as information. By putting in rent control and putting in a cap on prices, what you've done is that you've distorted the market mechanisms and you've told people, do not go into real estate, do not build, do not rent, do not put your extra bedroom. Oh, the kids have moved out. Don't put your bedroom up on Airbnb in the marketplace because we've put in rent controls. And so what you've done is you've disincentivized the market to address a demand that exists because you've distorted information. Remember, we need to start thinking about prices as information. And whenever government takes away the ability for people, because that's what the market is comprised of, is people. When the government takes away the ability for people to sort through information, you've disincentivized people to go into a particular marketplace to address a demand that might exist because they don't even know if a demand exists now because there's no information. So what you end up having is, in some cases, when you repeal price controls, what you've done now is that you've actually created a positive incentive structure for demand to be met where previously people didn't even know that there was demand that needed to exist. And so this is how you get a circumstance where if you repeal price controls on certain things, you might actually see the price drop. Maybe not instantly,
well,
but after more supply is driven into it, you might see prices actually drop.
This is so much simpler than again, economists are some of the most guilty on this and trying to make things more complex than they actually are. How do you get prices to go down? You increase supply or you decrease demand, right? That's it. It is just not that difficult. So what you should look at is, okay, prices for insulin are high. Okay, what do we do to foster an increase in supply? Well, if you remove regulatory barriers and you make it easier for people to actually bring this to market, then there'll be more on the market, there'll be more options, and prices will go down and reach an equilibrium. Okay, then why aren't you doing that? Well, can't we just cap prices? Yeah, you can try, but all you're going to do is eventually lead to shortages and other problems because you're not dealing with the real problem, which is a lack of supply to meet the demand. Now, you could decrease demand. This is where it gets into what Tina was talking about before. If the FDA, through the food pyramid and everyone else, is pushing an unhealthy lifestyle on Americans, right? If you're actually recommending foods and diets that you should not be recommending, and it causes people to actually need more medical care, right, or need more medications, well, now you've artificially increased demand through government intervention and meddling. So you can decrease demand, you can increase supply. There you go, magic done. Why do price controls? Again, why do things like rent controls not work? Because what you just said, it disincentivized the very people that you need to build more in order to meet that increased demand. You've just told them, well, if you do it, you're going to have to do it either at cost, for which there is no incentive, or you're going to have to do it in a way that you lose money, which is the opposite of incentive. And then a lot of people say, well, the solution is for the government to do it. Oh, the government, which is now operating in an environment where they're spending other people's money on some other problem, and they never do so efficiently or effectively, and always engage in again, either corruption or perverse incentives, which leads to slums, right? So look, guys, I don't know what to say. It's not that difficult, but price controls will never be the answer. Price controls will never be the answer because, as Christian already pointed out, it not only creates perverse incentive, it misunderstands what prices are in the first place and the coordinating function that they serve. So All right, I think we've gone for about 2 hours now on this question of price controls. But listen, we thought this was important because there's a mindset shift that needs to take place right now. And I'm just going to repeat what I just said again, just to kind of close this out. When you properly understand what prices actually are, that it's not such some sort of arbitrary thing that tells us how much our groceries cost, that it's actually information that is informing us about a whole host of things with respect to supply and demand and production costs. And when the government comes in and just starts meddling with it, just starts screwing with it, like it knows more than it actually does, right? It may be doing a lot to get you to vote for them, but it's actually making your situation ultimately worse because it's fundamentally misunderstanding the importance of the information process that prices play. And so we have to start with understanding what it is. And then I want to get to that question too, is in kind of my closing here on what Christian said about, like, how do we transfer this information to a generation? Look, if you're 50 years old and you're just furious and you've been in the union your entire life and you're convinced that Bernie Sanders price controls is what's going to, I'm probably not going to change your mind. I would like to think I could. I certainly think it's possible, but it's probably not the best use of either of our time, right? But what you can do is you can find ways to actually educate your kids so that they properly understand this, so they're not scared by it. Take the mysticism out of it. Again, the economy is not some like weird machine that can only be manipulated by experts and politicians. Nope. It's just people walking into the marketplace of both ideas, products, and services in order to better meet the challenges within their lives and finding ways that they can exchange value for value. That might be as an entrepreneur. It might be as a worker. It might be as an artisan. Who knows? But I do know this, in a free market, you get the opportunity to maximize your value while at the same time bringing values to others. And that's what we want. That's what we want. That's an optimal system. Now, does an optimal system never make mistakes? Of course not. We're fallible human beings. We will always make mistakes. But here's one of the things that you will notice. If you want probably the greatest repudiation of the socialist approach to economics, of the price control approach to economics, the central planning approach to economics, if you want the greatest repudiation possible of it, here's the only thing you really need to ask. What do poor people in those countries do when they get an opportunity? Do they stay? Or do they try to leave for countries which allow for greater free markets and individual liberty? They leave. Sometimes they risk life and limb in order to leave. But you know what I never see happening? I never see poor people in countries with free market economics and property rights going to the south of Florida in order to make leaky rafts in order to somehow make it to the socialist utopia of Cuba. And that's the greatest repudiation ever. It's not some argument that we can give you here. It's what the actual people that socialists claim to care about do when given the opportunity and when living under the regimes. I hope you have found this episode to be informative. And, obviously we're coming from a particular mindset here, but we think that mindset is rooted in truth. We have not invented any of these policies. We've merely discovered them. And we see that played out throughout world history. Again, we had read one article here where 4,000 year history of things. I'm hoping that maybe the next generation will learn just a little bit more than we did, because that's what all generations are supposed to do. Leave the next one a little bit better off than where you started. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Also, if you are looking for a good resource for your children on this, I encourage you to go check out the Tuttle Twins. They've got a lot of really good books on this. Also, you can check out the Tuttle Twins TV show on Angel Studios. They've got some really good programming as well. So you got books, you got programming. We use this for our own kids. We thought it was a great resource. If you watch the cartoons carefully, on I think season 3, there may be somebody in there that sounds distinctly like me, trying to talk in a more noble voice than I usually do. But anyways, thank you very much for joining us. Go check us out on Circle Chat, and we will see you next episode.